Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to this search test session. And today we're going to discuss about the topic of wound healing and tissue regeneration. Uh, I think yesterday I came to know about the pattern of students because there are some of you who are earlier into your career, and then some of you are a little bit more matured. Uh, so I'll try to cover up with a combination of both. I always feel that when you have a combination of clinical uh, relevance to a particular topic, then it becomes more easy for you people to understand what we are talking about. And then when you read, you understand the nitty gritty of the finer points which are given in the textbooks. So yesterday, I think one of you were asking about the nitrogen balance. Is that gentleman here who's asking about the nitrogen equilibrium? I think someone had raised a question yesterday on nitrogen equilibrium. Anyway, so we will discuss about that before you go to the topic today. So what is nitrogen balance? So starting off from the last session yesterday, it is a comparison between nitrogen intake and nitrogen loss from the body. Okay, so the definition is very clear. And nitrogen balance is the index of growth or anabolic state of the body. So whenever we are in the anabolic phase, the nitrogen balance is better. Proteins, we all know, are the source of nitrogen in the body. About 10 to 15% of the energy is derived from the proteins. But in absence of carbohydrates, so if you have a patient, where the carbohydrate stock is not there, or you have not given enough fluids, amino acids are used for the energy production. And as a result of this, what happens is that the nitrogen is excreted or lost in form of urea and nitrogen producing substances. So what is nitrogen balance or nitrogen equilibrium? It is nitrogen intake which should be equal to the output. So intake equal to output, which happens in all of us as healthy individuals. So we take in a lot of proteins in our meals, but when you have an intake and output match, that is a nitrogen equilibrium. Positive nitrogen balance means when you have more nitrogen intake compared to the output. So the intake is more, but the output is less. And this is necessary during growth or when you're recovering from the illness. That means you will be coming out of a very sick state. We saw yesterday about the catabolic phase. And when you come out of that, you need a good amount of nitrogen. So that's a positive nitrogen balance. And negative nitrogen balance is when the nitrogen intake is less, but the output is more. And this usually happens in patients who are sick. So yesterday, when we discussed about how from the muscles there is a wastage of the nitrogen and that gets excreted into the urine. So these are the patients who are into the negative nitrogen balance. So what is a positive nitrogen balance? Again, when the intake is greater than the loss. And this typically happens in conditions like growth. So especially in adult or puberty, pregnancy, or when the patient is recovering from illness. So a lot of times you will see patients who have recovered from the illness and they will be putting in a lot of weight. So when you see them after some time, if they have taken a good amount of protein intake in the diet, sorry, then you will have them into a positive nitrogen balance. And there are certain hormones which can lead to positive nitrogen balance, like growth hormone, insulin, androgens. So a lot of times in clinical practice, we also give anabolic steroids to the patients to put on the weight. So positive nitrogen balance means that the nitrogen intake is more than the loss. And again, as we revise, it occurs in these three conditions, while the negative nitrogen balance is where the loss is more than the intake, and it typically happens in patients with diabetes, fever, starvation, wasting diseases, especially after a very major complex surgeries. And nitrogen equilibrium basically means that the nitrogen intake is equal to the nitrogen loss, and it occurs in healthy adults on an adequate normal diet. So this is what typically happens in a nitrogen equilibrium. You take a dietary protein, and there is an amino acid pool and the tissue proteins which constantly interact with each other, and then they lead to two components. One is a nucleotide, heme and energy, and the second part is excreted out as a urea into the urine. So this typically what happens in a normal healthy individual or a non-pregnant lady. In positive nitrogen balance, what happens is that the amino acid pool, that means the intake part is more, and it leads to more tissue protein. So patients will be putting on a lot of, so you see a lot of bodybuilders taking a lot of artificial sources of nitrogen protein powders. And this is what typically happens in them. but they are at the risk because there's an excretion of the urea, and quite often we have heard about they getting problems because of the kidney diseases earlier on because of the high intake. And negative nitrogen balance, which occurs during the stress period. So the proteins which are actually in the muscles, stored in the skeletal muscles, are wasted out. And we saw that sometimes it can be in the tune of 250 to 500 grams of proteins which are lost, and that's again excreted out into the urine in different forms as urea or ammonia and uric acid. So this is what happens in that. What is nitrogen balance? So nitrogen balance is calculated as protein intake divided by 6.25, and minus the urinary urea nitrogen plus the fecal losses plus the obligatory losses of about 2 to 4 grams per day. So whenever you have a specialized enteral formula, then the different coefficient of conversion will be coming in. So a lot of times we give these patients, we give them protein powders or protein shakes, like pre-digested meals, and that is the time when this equation will be different. So nitrogen balance is nothing but it is calculated in this way. The total protein intake divided by 6.25 minus the urea urinary nitrogen plus the fecal losses plus obligatory losses. This is what we just saw now. And the clinical application of nitrogen balance and the catabolic index assessment is like this. So again, the same formula. So we assume that in a 70 kilogram male who takes about 105 grams of protein, about 20 grams of urinary urea nitrogen over 24 hours. So 105 grams, that is the protein intake, divided by 6.25 minus 20 plus 4, so it's about minus 7.2 grams. And the catabolic index of that patient is UUN minus into bracket half into dietary nitrogen plus 3, that is 20 grams minus 0.5 into 16.8 grams plus 3, so which indicates severe stress, that is 8.6. So less than 0 is no significant stress, 0 to 5 is significant stress, and above 5 is more stress. So for a 70 kg male, 105 grams of proteins will be very, very high. So some of you who want to probably calculate this or understand this formula, because this kind of coefficients will be given to you in the exams, you need to by heart this formula of how to calculate the balance by the protein intake divided by 6.25 into this, and then finally you will be given a clinical scenario where you will be told that whether this is a condition of low significant stress or significant stress or severe stress. So this is just to sum up the yesterday's part about the nitrogen equilibrium. I hope the gentleman who had asked, probably his doubts are very clear. Is he around today? Someone asked this question yesterday. So with this nitrogen equilibrium understanding, I think we will now next go on to our topic for today, which is going to be wound healing, and we're going to talk about tissue regeneration. So wound healing is a process in the body which goes in terms of a proper sequencing. That means there is step 1, then there is step 2, then there is step 3, then there is step 4, and things are designed in that way in the body so that everything goes stepwise. So let me start off this evening with this particular orchestra, and you can see how each one has followed its sequence so that we can get a good rhythmic music. So if you see here, there is the place of the violins coming in, and after that you have the chords coming in, and after that, so each one is playing its his or her own sequential role, and this is how our body is designed, and we have the process of healing occurring that way. So coming to the concept of wound and ulcer, so what happens in wound healing? So one has to understand very clearly that there are 4 phases of wound healing. This typically starts from the time that you make an incision, or if the patient has got a trauma. The first step is the step of hemostasis. So typically we have The blood clot here, we all know that it is the formation of the white plaque first, then formation of the red plaque first, and then you have the hemostasis. If the hemostasis stage is taken care well, then it goes into the next stage, which is the stage of inflammation. So in the stage of inflammation, typically you will have a scab formation. The fibroblasts will start migrating in that area. The monocytes will then get converted to macrophages. They also start moving in there. The next step after this is going to be the step of proliferation, which is a proliferative phase, where you'll be having fibroblasts surrounding in that area. The wound will start getting a little smaller. It will get more drier. You will have a scab formation. Okay, so then you have the phase, which is a phase of remodeling. Okay, so hemostasis, inflammatory, proliferative, remodeling. We will be talking about this more frequently during this presentation, so you need to understand this for. And in the chronic wound, what happens is there is a stall in the inflammatory phase. So here itself, the wound doesn't go any further, and that's the reason you have patients who have chronic wounds. So again, the stages of wound healing, the bleeding phase or the hemostasis, then you have the inflammatory phase, the proliferative phase, and the remodeling phase. So these are again the same sequences. So the wound from this, where you have a blood clot, that finally lands up into something which we call it as a scar, where you have a freshly healed epidermis and a freshly healed dermis. So these are the different stages. The stage one, when the wound looks something like this. Then this is a stage two. This is typically happens in the patient where you have kept the wound open. We will be discussing about that. That's the stage three. And finally, you will have the same wound which will be undergoing a contraction and the scar formation in stage four. So there are two types of wounds, tidy and untidy. So in exams, you may have a question where you'll be mentioned that what is the contaminated wound type. So you should be in a position to answer that the contaminated comes in the category of an untidy wound. So incised, clean, healthy tissue, seldom tissue loss will be a tidy wound, while an untidy will be crushed, contaminated, devitalized, and often tissue loss. Remember in exams, especially your practicals, there's a difference between wound and ulcer. Ulcer is a breach in the continuity of the surface epithelium with molecular death of cells. So one has to be very, very clear when you give an exams, understanding between a wound and an ulcer. When you have a molecular death of cells, then you have a formation of ulcer. Otherwise, it is a wound. So what are the microscopic changes which we see in this kind of a situation? So in the stage of hemostasis, what happens is you will have vasoconstriction, platelet aggregation, or the formation of the white plaque and leukocyte migration. So this typically happens in seconds to hours. So you have done a major laparotomy wound, you have done hemostasis inside, and that's where you will have that. The next stage after that is the inflammatory phase, which goes on for a couple of days. And here what happens is earlier on, you have the neutrophils coming in, the chemoattractant release, there is a late macrophages coming in, phagocytosis and removal of the foreign body of the bacteria. So the wound starts getting cleansed up in the phase of inflammation. This can be one of the MCQ questions which can come up, that what exactly happens in the inflammatory phase, how long does it last? So that could be a question there. Third is the proliferative phase, which happens from days to weeks. We will be coming into the numbers, right numbers there, where fibroblast proliferation occurs. You have collagen synthesis. And typically you should understand that this is a phase in the first 3 weeks where you have the type 3 collagen getting converted to type 1. We have around 19 types of collagen in the body, but the type 3 gets converted to type 1, which is from the immature one to the mature one. So if the patient has got a collagen deficiency, that gets suffered specifically in this phase, and that's where the wound healing gets suffered. So you have extracellular matrix deorganization, angiogenesis, and granulation tissue formation, which typically happens in the proliferative phase. So again, a question which can come up, when does the granulation tissue formation actually start? Whether it is in the hemostasis, inflammatory, proliferative, or remodeling. So we know the answer when it happens. And then the fourth stage is a remodeling stage, or the stage where it leads to scar formation. This is the stage where you will have the extracellular matrix remodeling, increase in the tensile strength of the wound, and finally you will have a healed tissue. But remember, this stage goes on for almost about 2 years, and then the final scar, which is going to form at the end of 2 years, is always 80% strong. So the wound is never 100% strong compared to what it was. It is always 80% strong. So how is this important in the clinical practice? Because if you have a patient, say for example, if you have a case of hernia, and if you're going to follow up this patient to label that this patient is not going to get a recurrence, one needs to actually follow up that patient for about 2 years. So you've done a laparotomy, you need to follow up for 2 years to understand that this patient is not going to get any recurrence, because the remodeling stage actually stops at that time. So in the inflammatory phase, this is what happens. You have all the iron load, the hypoxia, hyperglycemia, and if you have one of these factors, this will lead to poor wound healing. So we saw in inflammatory phase what all comes up there, but if you have any one of these in the patient, then the wound healing can get hampered. So in the inflammatory phase, what are the roles? There's a role of IL-6. We discussed yesterday about the pro and the anti-inflammatory interleukins. So inflammatory cells will typically enter the wound like lymphocytes, neutrophils, and monocytes. And we all know that these monocytes, and they get converted into macrophages. Now we have identified two types of macrophages, M1 and M2. The M2 are the one which are probably anti-inflammatory, and the M1 are the one which are inflammatory. So nowadays there's a current concept of going in for an M2 macrophage-based scaffoldings, which will be talking in the tissue regeneration part, because these are the ones which are responsible for anti-inflammatory action. After the inflammatory phase, you have the proliferative phase, where fibroblast is released as a collagen scaffold. So I talked about type 3 and type 1. Keratinocytes migrate over the scaffold, and then M1 is more than M2. So there's a polarization and angiogenesis occurs. So you'll have a new bleeding vessels, and this is where you will have the formation of granulation tissue. And then you have the remodeling phase, where the scar is established. The macrophage quantity starts receding there. It becomes lesser and lesser. The fibroblasts continue to remodel the collagen in the scar, improving the pliability and the appearance. Now, if this gets affected, we will be discussing about the scars and hypertrophic scars and keloids. So it is at this stage where the fibroblast remodeling goes topsy-turvy, where you will have varied clinical outcomes in the patient, and you'll have smaller vascular tissue aggregates getting into larger vessels. So this is what typically happens in this stage. And if you see on the right-hand side, the role of interleukin 6, it has several activities: promote switching from M1 to M2 macrophages, then facilitating in the proliferative phase, you have inflammatory secretions of KGF, what is a keratinocyte growth factor. Then you have the several other growth factors which are secreted during the proliferative phase. And one needs to understand this, because this again could be a question in the exams, that when do you have the growth factor secretions? This typically will happen in the proliferative phase. And in the remodeling, the interleukin 6 levels return to the normal as they were in the normal condition. So a very busy slide, but a lot of MCQs based questions can come up into this. So one needs to understand these three phases very, very clearly. So there is always a time lag. So what is the time lag coming to that? So in the inflammatory phase, usually it will be there for about the first 1 week. Hemostasis, we saw that it happens in the first 24 hours. Inflammatory phases are about first 4 to 6 days. It is marked by edema, erythema, inflammation, and pain. So we talk about the rubor, dolor, calor. So all those things will be in the phase of inflammation. So typically a patient who undergoes a surgery, post-surgery, you will see a lot of swelling and redness. So we always tell the patient that this swelling and everything will come down, just give it some time. And that's where we give a lot of times anti-inflammatory, because these anti-inflammatory are the ones which will help in reducing this hyperinflammation stage. And then the healing process is triggered. Immune system works to prevent microbial colonization. So this is a time when you will have lesser amount of microbial colonies which will be washed out. Coming to the proliferative phase, which lasts for around 4 to 24 days, around 3 weeks is the time when you will have the proliferative phase which will be going on. That's typically when the granulation tissue fills in the wound. So you can see here, so whenever you see in your dressings in the post-op ward rounds, you see the granulation tissue coming up. That typically happens in the proliferative phase. The wound edges start becoming to contract a bit. They don't contract drastically, but there's a little contraction. And epithelial cells migrate from the wound margins. So we call it as an epitheliation. So if you have a wound which is closed, the epithelial bridging which happens typically happens during this phase. And if you have at the end of 3 weeks your wound looking relatively good, there are less likely chances that this patient will go into a stage of chronic wound because that typically happens around this time. So 4 to 6 days is the inflammatory phase. Up to 3 weeks is the proliferative phase. The next is the maturation phase, which is, as I told you, 3 weeks to almost about 2 years. The wound is about 80% strong. And what happens in that is the wound is filled completely and it is strengthened and the scar tissue forms. So again, a very busy slide, but it is giving you the time gaps. One needs to understand this because in exams, again, you will have questions where they'll be talking about how many days or how many weeks a particular phase is lasting, or one of these pictures can be put up and you can be told about that. So wound healing stages. What do you mean by that? There are three typical ways in which a wound heals. One is by the primary intention. That means you have done a laparotomy or an incised wound and you have sutured that primarily. By an early suture, this will typically lead into a hairline scar. This is known as the healing by primary intention. The second one is healing by secondary intention. So what typically happens is you keep the wound open. And when you keep the wound open, because there was contamination or there was something there, you just keep it open and then gradually everything grows over it. And then the wound ultimately heals. This is the healing which is happening by, scar formation or by secondary intention. And the third is a type of tertiary intention where the wound is left open. There's a granulation tissue which forms and then you do a suturing. So what typically we talk about secondary suturing of the wound. So secondary suturing of the wound is equivalent to tertiary intention. So there's a catch in the words. So secondary suturing, tertiary intention. So in tertiary intention, it is something where you will be having a patient with a big chronic wound, which will be granulated. But because the edges are not coming to each other, you take up the patient in the OR, freshen up the edges, and then close the wound. This is healing by tertiary intention, or what we also call in clinical practice as secondary suturing. So this is what happens in the primary intention, a wound sutured, and then there is a hairline scar. This is healing by primary intention. So this is typically a wound. You can see here a laparotomized patient where you can see it was done and the closure was done in that patient. And after the closure, you can see there's a nice formation. This is healing by primary intention. Healing by secondary intention is where the wound is kept open and the edges are not brought close to each other. So the secondary union happens. This happens when you have a loss of cell. That means a patient who's got a road traffic accident, or patients where you have debrided a very bad wound on the thigh or on the buttocks or on the back. And then you have debrided. A classical example is a carbuncle, where you debride completely and you keep it open and allow it to heal. This is healing by secondary intention. But when the edges of the carbuncle, you feel everything is healed, and then you take up this patient for a suturing, that will be by tertiary intention. So there is abundant amount of granulation tissue from the margins, and this will then slowly come together and close the wound. So there are a lot of clinical application to this because there are a lot of growth factors which are available now exogenously, which can accelerate this phase of secondary intention. So by giving growth factors in form of local topical application, you can accelerate the epitheliation of the wound, and the closure of the wound can occur in these cases. So classically, this is an example where the patient had a burst abdomen and then the wound is kept open there. This is healing by secondary intention. And then the wound contracts further, something like this, and then there is a scar formation. Tertiary intention is where there's a wound and you have kept it open. The granulation is hypergranulation tissue now in the proliferative phase, and then you decide to suture off that. So you remove the excess of the tissue over there, and then you do suturing, which is known as a secondary suturing, but this is healing by tertiary intention. So there is an in-between stage now where wounds which are healing by secondary intention, there's a new system which is known as a vacuum assisted closure, or a device. Now, this is a new concept which has been there almost for about a decade or more, and you'll be seeing this more and more into the clinical practice because this is the one which we use more often. So look at this example. This is a lady who had a laparotomy done, and you can see the wound and everything was bad there. Then she had an infection in the mesh, and this is typically how a VAC device is put in. So what it typically does is it increases and removes the interstitial fluid. So whatever is the fluid formation in that area, it sucks out that, and because of the mere pressure, you can see that the dirty areas and all slough is all removed from there, and you can see the wound from this has contracted to this size. So vacuum assisted closures are now on the go because these are the ones which allow the wounds to contract better and faster. So what do you do in a patient with an acute wound care? So you get a patient with an acute wound, or say, for example, someone has got an infected ulcer with a pus formation. So what are you going to do? First is cleaning of the wound. So proper cleansing of the wound with thorough wash with saline, removing all the debris. Then explore the wound, because if it's a roadside wound trauma, you never know whether there are any metal particles or any dirt particles in that wound. So you would like to even clean up all those. So you do that. The next thing is the step is debridement. That means you remove all the dirty element which is there in that wound and try to make it from an untidy wound to a tidy wound. Repair of the structure. So you may have an associated tendon injury or a muscle injury, sometimes a nerve injury or a vessel injury. So all that will be replaced, and replace the tissue wherever there is a loss. So for example, you have a patient where patient has got an injury on the palm, and then there was a trauma, and then there was a complete avulsion or the removal of that area. You'll probably do a free flap. You will take up a tissue harvested from somewhere else and try to cover up in that area. So this is what we mean by replacement of the lost tissue. Skin cover if required. So sometimes you can put in a partial thickness skin graft, a split thickness skin graft, and cover up that area. And skin closure should be done without tension. So if you feel if the wound is coming under a lot of tension, then you can close that wound without any tension. And if you feel it's coming under tension, then leave the wound open and allow it to heal by secondary intention with granulation tissue. And all of the above should be done with meticulous tissue handling and good techniques. Coming to the concept of the leg ulcer, we defined ulcer in the beginning that it is nothing but it is a breach in the continuity of the surface epithelium with molecular death of cells. Remember that you need to be very, very specific in exams. I'll give you an example of a student where in the exams they had mentioned that there is a raw area over the left foot, and then the examiner had actually asked for the medical Dorland's dictionary, and then they found out that is there any word called raw, and nothing was mentioned in the Dorland's medical dictionary like raw. So there is nothing like using this kind of loose terms in exams. You have to be very clear whether you're talking about a wound or you're talking about an ulcer. So venous disease can lead to venous hypertension. Classical is a leg ulcer, which we see in the lower limb. And this happens because of the venous hypertension, because of the varicose veins. Then you can have an arterial ulcer, which typically happens in the patients with diabetes or a large vessel disease like atherosclerosis. Then you have patients who have got arthritis. That means the inflammation of the end arterioles. And this can be associated in patients with autoimmune disease like rheumatoid or lupus. Trauma itself can lead to an ulcer formation. Then you have patients with chronic infection like tuberculosis, which is very common in India, or syphilis. And finally, you can have malignant ulcers because of the squamous or the basal cell carcinoma or sarcoma. Coming to the infection part, what is also known as necrotizing fasciitis. Necrotizing fasciitis, you typically look at this picture. So what happens is that the inflammation is beyond the area of the erythema. So you may have this typical patchy area where your layers of the skin, subcutaneous and fascia is lost, and you will be getting erythema around it. You'll be getting crepitus because there'll be a typical, spongy feeling in this area. Now remember one thing, that compared to the clostridial infection or a gas gangrene, the amount of gas which you will be seeing in necrotizing fasciitis is more compared to gas gangrene, which happens because of the Clostridium welchi. So this is one of the little paradox which you need to know in practice, that if you see a lot of gas on an X-ray of the patient or in the wound, it's little unlikely. But if you see more of a gangrenous changes, a short rapid history, then that goes in favor of something like a gas gangrene. Then you will also have something which is known as a water pus, a pink or orange skin staining, as you can see it in the wound. A focal skin gangrene will be a little late sign, and these kind of patients would typically have a hyper response. We discussed about inflammation yesterday. So these kind of patients can come up with shock and coagulopathy. So we saw yesterday how you can have a DIC or a consumptive coagulopathy, and that can lead to multi-organ failure. So necrotizing infection, most commonly it happens because of the gram-positive aerobes, which is typically Staph aureus or Streptococcus pyogenes. It can also happen because of the gram-negative anaerobes like E. coli, Pseudomonas, Clostridium, and bacteroids. So this again can be an MCQ questions. What kind of organisms are present in necrotizing soft tissue infections? There'll be usually a history of trauma with wound contamination, and sometimes the patient's own defense condition may be deficient. These infections are presented with sudden rapid progression. The DP tissues involved, which are diagnosed a little late, you just saw the picture which I showed you. And there are two main types of fasciitis in necrotizing. One is a gas gangrene type, and the second is a non-gas gangrene type, which is typically of streptococcal variant. The streptococcus is also known as a flesh-eating bug. Typically, how it manifests is you will see a wound. The next day, you will see a post-laparotomy. Classically, I've seen many times following C-sections. The patient, the wound is opened up, and you will see a typical black margin with a lot of erythema. You debride that area. The next day you go in, you see that there is further eating up of that area. So typically, a flesh-eating bug, again, MCQ question, is Streptococcus pyogenes. So remember that, because this again can come up. And as I earlier mentioned, that in the gas gangrene, you will have lesser amount of gas compared to a non-Clostridial infection, where the amount of gas will be more. And tissue biopsies are very, very essential for establishing tissue diagnosis. What is compartment syndrome? So this is typically a case where you will be, I'm sure each one of you must have done a fasciotomy. So whenever there is a more of an inflammatory fluid formation into a tight compartment, something like this. So this is an actual view or a 4-compartment fasciotomy. So this is how our cross section through the lower leg is. You have the anterior compartment, then you have a deep posterior compartment, a superficial posterior compartment, and a lateral compartment. So this is typically a cross section which is taken at the level of the leg. Now imagine if you have any kind of an inflammatory process going around in this area, the whole areas are all diverged with different kind of fascias, so it will not allow things to come out. There will be a compromise on the blood vessel. So typically what is done is we take a release incision, and that is also known as a 4-compartment fasciotomy. So incisions are made medially and laterally into all the 4 compartments into this area. So you'll have one incision here, one on this side, one on the posterior side, one on the lateral side. And with this, what will happen is, by taking the release incision, you saw that you're opening up this compartment. So here the anterior and the lateral has been released, which typically we saw in this picture, that the moment you take that, you will find a bulgy muscle which will be coming up. And why do we need to do that? Now, the reason we need to do that is because if you don't do this, you can look at these blood vessels here. These start getting compressed. And because they start getting compressed, what happens is that there's a pressure on that, and these patients can undergo an ischemic changes very, very fast. So these are time-directed therapies which you need to work on very, very fast, because if you don't act on this very fast, then you can have troubles. So the goal is to release a compression on the vessels. We all know that veins are easily compressible, but the arteries are not. But in these kind of cases, the goal directed is more towards the arterial problems, where you can, by releasing incisions, you can reduce the compartment pressure. Again, the compartments as shown at this level, the superficial and the deep compartment, the lateral compartment and the anterior compartment. So these are the compartments which you will typically see. You can again have an MCQ in the exams that what do you mean by the 4-compartment release. So we need to understand that you're going to take releases on this aspects, release anterior, lateral, and both the superficial and the deep compartments. So in this way, by taking release incisions, the pressure on the arteries are offloaded and the patients can get better. Again, the same depiction about the cross section. The muscles are swollen up and they cause compression on the blood vessels inside. The moment you take up an incision, things are fine. And what are the blood vessels? Typically, you will see the anterior tibial artery, which typically runs in this area here. And then you have the posterior tibial artery, which runs between the anterior and the posterior compartment. This is where you have the posterior tibial artery. So this is what can get compromised. So in the injuries, we saw something about so you're trying to make an untidy wound into a tidy wound. Or say, for example, a patient comes with a slash injury or a glass cut injury to the extremity, and you have a nerve damage. And typically, you're going to repair this nerve. The suture material we will be discussing in another section, but the typical sutures which we use will be around 80 or a 90, silk sutures which are going to use for this, or Prolene sutures for nerve repairs because they are very, very fine and you'll be using it in the loop. So how does a nerve regeneration occur? So nerves always degenerate distal to the wound. So there is something which is known as Wallerian degeneration. Proximally, the nerve suffers traumatic degeneration as far as the last node of Ranvier. We'll be seeing the picture soon. And the regenerating nerve fibers are attracted to the receptors by neurotrophism. Remember this because this again can be a question in the MCQ, that the regenerating nerve fiber are attracted by which receptors? By the mechanism of neurotrophism, which is mediated by growth factors, hormones, and other extracellular matrix. Nerve regeneration is characterized by profuse growth of new fibers which sprout from the cut proximal end. Overgrowth of this, okay, so if you have an overgrowth of this sprouting, coupled with poor approximation, it can lead to a neuroma formation. A classical example of this is you have injured the ilioinguinal nerve while performing a groin hernia. So this is what typically happens, or sometimes you can have even in the upper extremities where you have repaired a nerve, and if there is too much of sprouting of the vessels, it can lead to neuroma, and the patient sometimes can tell you, that they get an electric current like sensation all of a sudden if someone touches that point. So nerve approximation is very, very important to have a good, what are the different grades of nerve injury? So if you see, if this is an intact nerve, you can have a neuropraxia. So something like this, where the outer sheath is intact and then you have just the stretching. Or exotomasis, where the axons are divided completely. Or neurotomasis, where the nerve is divided completely. So these are the different grades of nerve injuries. And depending on these different grades, the healing will be occurring. So for example, the upper part. So you have a cell here, that's an axon, that's the site of the injury here. What happens to the site of injury is that the distal portion, we saw that, Wallerian degeneration. The distal portion of the fiber degenerates in this area. Then the proximal end, which is this end, of the nerve fibers regenerate into the tube of the sheath cells. So from here, slowly then you will have the healing which starts, followed by the neurolemmocytes proliferation and axonal growth. And finally, this will get connected to the skeletal muscle fiber. So this is a cycle which typically happens when the nerve regenerates. So one needs to understand about it. Again, to recapitulate what I was talking, that it generates distal to the wound, Wallerian degeneration occurs. So we saw that there's a degenerated part, something here. So this part gets degenerated, which is a Wallerian degeneration, followed by the proximal nerve ends which start going into the sheath of cells, and then you have the axonal growth, and finally you have the connection established. So again, the same thing, there's an injury here, then you have the distal regeneration, a degeneration, followed by that you have the proximal end coming in there, and then finally you have an intact neurosynaptic combination done. So this is how typically a nerve will regenerate, and one needs to understand about this very clearly, because if you don't understand this, it becomes very difficult in your exams to answer your MCQs. A tendon, you may have a tendon injury in the patient. What happens? Although it follows a normal pattern of the wound healing, there are two mechanisms whereby nutrient cells and new vessels reach the severe tendon. So what are these mechanisms? These are intrinsic, which consist of vincular blood flow and synovial diffusion, and extrinsic, which depend on the formation of fibrous adhesions. So tendon injury will heal by intrinsic and extrinsic mechanisms. So this is how you will be getting in an MCQ, and you will be asked about it. So you should know that it heals by two different mechanisms. And the random nature of the initial collagen produced means that tendon lacks tensile strength for the first 3 to 6 weeks. That means we saw in the wound about the phase of collagen formation type 3 to type 1. Now, this is very random in the tendon and it goes on for almost 3 to 6 weeks. That's the reason when clinically you operate and repair a tendon, you do not allow these patients to mobilize that particular arm for at least 6 weeks. You put them into different kind of splints because this is what is required. And if you don't do that, then you can have problems. And active mobilization prevents adhesions, limiting the range of motion. But the tendon must be protected by a splintage to avoid rupture, because we saw the tendon repairs, heal by intrinsic mechanisms and the extrinsic mechanisms. Now imagine if you have mobilized this patient earlier on, these two mechanisms can go for a toss, and then you can have a problem. So remember this. How does the repair of the tendon occur? So this is how a tendon unit looks like. That's a macro structure of the tendon. Then you have the fiber bundles, then you have the collagen fibers. These are typically at the microscopic level. You have the tenocytes, the tendon stem progenitor cells, the perivascular tendon stem cells, and the vasculature. So these are again things which will be again focused up in the exams. You should know what are tenocytes or tendon stem progenitor cells, perivascular tendon stem cells, progenitor cells, and the vasculature, which is mentioned over here. So this is how a cut section of a tendon will look like. Coming to something which is known as a pressure sore, or what commonly we call it as a bed sore. So how does it form? So the pathophysiology is, there are a lot of pressure areas on the soft tissue which come in contact with the bony prominence. When this pressure exceeds the normal capillary pressure, that means there's a pressure within the capillary. Now imagine that there's a blood flow going on in my finger right now, and if I keep this pressed on a particular point for hours together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the pressure, which will be more than the capillary pressure in that area. This will cause occlusion and tearing of the small blood vessels. The perfusion in that part then will get compromised. You will have ischemic necrosis and formation of a pressure sore. So this again would be a clinical based MCQ question. You will be asked about how does the pathophysiology form, or what exactly happens to the capillary pressure when you have a bed sore formation. So this is the typical cycle which one needs to understand. Now this slide tells you about the different pressure points. So the patient is in supine position, the back of the head, the shoulder, the elbow, the buttocks, and the heel. These are the areas which are under constant pressure. So if you have a patient who's going to be in the supine position, say for example, head injury with a tracheostomy there on a ventilator, look at all these areas. Just don't look at the back and forget about it. Look at all these areas because they are the ones which can be responsible. When you put the patient in the lateral position for some reason, if the patient has got a big wound here, or you're going to put in a skin a grafting here, or some kind of an orthopedic procedure is done and patient is kept in this area, these are the red points which tell you typically the area where you can have a pressure sore formation. And then in COVID days, we have all seen patients were kept in a prone position ventilation. Why? Because the ventilation was supposed to be better in the COVID stage. And these are the areas again. So elbow, rib cage, because we have not seen too much of prone ventilation. But in the COVID, when I was in the ICU posting, we had to put a lot of patients on the prone position ventilation. And even when they were shifted in the wards, they were being told to do this. So these are the pressure points which happen at that level. So pressure sore or a bed sore in the frequency in the descending order. Okay. So ischium is probably the topmost one which can develop that. The next will be the greater trochanter, then you have the sacrum, then the heel, then the malleolus and the occiput. So in the decreasing order from the highest to the lowest, you will have ischium to occiput. So you may have a MCQ again over here that in ischium, or if you may be given an option A, B, C, D, that which one is the one which can get the highest amount of pressure sore or maybe an early pressure sore, the answer to that question would be ischia. So this is a sequence which you should have in your mind. And if you know this picture very clearly, which I showed you earlier on, then you can answer that. So if you know this picture very clearly, you can answer that buttocks or this area will be the first one to get a pressure sore. How do you stage them? So stage 1 is a non-blanchable erythema without a breach in the epidermis. In stage 2, you will have a partial thickness skin loss involving epidermis and dermis. Okay. Stage 3, there will be a full thickness skin loss. It will extend into the subcutaneous area, but not the overlying fascia. And in stage 4, you will have a full thickness fascia with extensive tissue destruction, maybe sometimes involving muscle, bone, or a tendon. So again, a question in the exams, you'll be given that Mr. So-and-so has a pressure sore, which is where you can see the subcutaneous tissue, but you cannot see the bone underlying. In what stage is this pressure sore? So this is stage 3. Okay. So something like this, again, to give you in the picture form. Stage 1, skin is unbroken but inflamed. Stage 2, epidermis and dermis would be breached, but you can see here that the fat is still probably intact there. Then the ulcer extends up to the subcutaneous area. You will not see the fat in that area. That is stage 3. And stage 4 is where you'll probably have it almost going up to the level of the bone. This will be the stage.
So
Why does this happen? So chronic wound is nothing but there is a stop or there is something like a red signal which comes into the wound healing cascade and it arrests at different stages. So this is typically what happens when we saw the wound healing. In a chronic wound, there will probably be an axe over here. And then this probably will delay the further process and you will have a patient which will go into a chronic wound. So what are the factors which will be affecting the wound healing or which can lead into chronicity? Local factors, ischemia, infection, foreign bodies or edema. Then you can have general factors like age, obesity, smoking, and alcohol intake. And then you can have systemic factors like cardiovascular, respiratory, metabolic, endocrine, renal, hepatic failure. So these are the typical ones which can lead to wound healing. Any one of these in any of these patients can affect the wound healing of the patient. Coming to another concept of degloving injury or what we call as also an avulsion injury. So what typically happens is that the skin gets peeled off of that area, and it typically happens when someone gets slided over. You have an injury where the patient has got something like a friction burn, and patient gets carried away on the roadside, and then he gets anchored into one of the areas where that becomes an entry point, and then the whole skin can get wrapped up. So this is again a degloving injury which happens over the hand. So what is typically done is you check for the vascularity of the skin. So it is like something like zipping and unzipping a pair of clothes. So when you take it off completely, this is what typically looks like. So that's the reason it is known as a degloving, because when you remove the glove, it's actually we peel off that over our fingers, and that's the name degloving injury. So let us talk something about the scar now. So we all know that the scar typically happens in the stage of remodeling. So you'll have a different 3 types. One is a normotropic scar, something like this. The second entity is also known as a hypertrophic scar. And then you have something which is known as a keloid. Remember these pictures because this will help us in our further studies. So microscopically, what happens between a hypertrophic scar and keloid? So if you have an individual where it has gone beyond the stage of normal healing, so collagen bundles in hypertrophic scar will be fine, well organized, wavy parallel to the epidermis. Myofibroblast would be present. PCNA expressing will be low. Mucin deposition will be negative. ATP levels will be low. Hyaluronic acid major component would be in the papillary dermis. Apoptosis will be decreased and P53 level will be low. Again, this can be your MCQ question, that what happens to the P53 levels in hypertrophic scar? It will be low. So these are some of the tougher questions which can come up, like we had the discussion about nitrogen equilibrium yesterday. So this is something which can come up in exams. In keloids, you will have large, thick, closely packed random dermis. Myofibroblast will be absent. So remember, in hypertrophic scars, you will have a presence of myofibroblast, while in keloids, it will be absent. PCN expressions will be very high. Mucin deposition, focal expression in dermis, ATP levels will be very, very high. Now, why it is high, I cannot make you understand that. So these are certain things which you will have to understand, because this is what typically happens. Hyaluronic acid localization will be thickened. There'll be granular and spinous layers. Amorphous substance there'll be a diffuse pattern. Apoptosis will be increased, and P53 levels will be very, very high in case of keloids, but it doesn't happen in case of hypertrophic scar. So inflammation, cell proliferation, matrix modeling, there is a time process which goes on all these things. There are myofibroblasts which are released, and in excess of scarring, when you have excess of scarring, so why do these patients develop this? Is because they will have increase in the growth factors here. There'll be increase in the collagen. So everything will be more. So even in clinical practice, when the patient asks me why I have got this, I tell them that God is probably giving you more than what is required, and that's the reason you are over healing. And you will have the matrix metalloproteinase 9 increase in this area. So in this stages, again, you will have MMP2, MMP9, which will be increased. So this is typically the cycle of up and down, crescendo, decrescendo, which happens in normal wound healing, while in excessive scarring, everything will be very, very high. And that's the reason you will have these patients developing hypertrophic scar or keloid. So can anyone tell me what is this, the figure on the left? Is it a hypertrophic scar or a keloid? Anyone? You can just unmute yourself and answer that.
Keloid. Hypertrophic scar. Maybe.
So one is saying hypertrophic scar, one is keloid. Okay, so we will see that why. Okay. So look at the difference here. This is a keloid here. Okay. You can see that it has gone over the edges over there. And look at this. Yeah, there's a classical difference. Again, coming back to the same one. So now you can appreciate this is a keloid here, and that's a hypertrophic scar. So you saw that wound where the wound was healing by secondary intention in the laterotomy wound. That was something like a hypertrophic scar formation. Okay. So this is again something like a contracture which happens post-traumatic. This is known as a chainsaw type of a contracture. So again, this patient has developed a hypertrophic scar because it is within its own purviewed limit. What happens in keloid is it tries to overgrow beyond that. And we saw in the microscopic diffraction that in hypertrophic scar, you will have a myofibroblast secretions, while in keloid, you may not be having that. And that's the reason the keloid will be more diffuse. It will be spread over. So it's more like a flattened variety. It overgrows its normal area, while hypertrophic scar will be typically seen something like this. Okay. So what is the treatment? How do you treat this kind of patients under this form? So one is in form of the pressure garments we'll be seeing. Then you have silicone gel sheeting. The mechanism is unknown, but there is a material called silicone gel, which I'll just show you. So this is how the silicone gel looks like. So by that, you give a pressure on that area. So you don't allow the heap of scar to form on one top of the other. This is what is the mechanism. So you give a compression over there. Then you give intralesional steroid injection, something like a triamcinolone, something like this. And then the way you have to give it is that you give the injection till it blanches. A lot of times I've seen people giving this injection, but they don't give till it blanches because you have to give it intralesional. So this is nothing around the lesion, but you have to give it within the lesion. And this is what helps in treatment of keloid. And then you have excision with steroid injection, excision with post-op radiation. So the golden rule is that whenever you have more than one treatment modality for a single clinical problem, that means everything is working in equal amount. So again, you can have a question on MCQ here that what is the best treatment available, or what is true about treatment for keloids or hypertrophic scar. So here you can see that practically every option is available because every option does work in cases of hypertrophic scar or keloids. So this is what one does when you have a case of hypertrophic scar or keloid. You do this or you do that and you give it till it blanches. Okay. We discussed about the VAC earlier on. but this is a technical detail that you give a pressure about minus 125 millimeters of mercury, so you suck out that much, which helps in faster debridement and formulation of the granulation tissue. The basic way, so this is a wound in this area, there's a whack applied there, this is a typical patient soiled in the perineal area. How does it work? It reduces edema, it removes interstitial fluid, and it increases the blood flow. So again, you may have a question, what is the principle of mechanism of vacuum assisted closure? It works by reducing the edema, removing interstitial fluid, and increasing the blood flow. So this is how typically it works. Okay. So in fetal wound healing, I'll just cover up this part. It proceeds without fibrosis of scar compared to an adult wound healing. Very interesting. So the fetal wounds, when they heal, they skip this kind of area. So you'll always see that in patients who have been laparotomized, in the very young age, you will probably have almost a scarless healing in all those cases. So look at this statement, that the proposed contributing factors to scarless healing in fetal wounds are perhaps because of fewer neutrophils, more monocytes during inflammatory phase, differentiate concentrations of cytokines, and great proportion of type 3 in contrast to the adult wounds. So more type 3 will get converted to more type 1, which is a mature collagen, and you will have a better healing. So these are the differences between the fetal and the adult fibroblast, collagen synthesis wise, propyl hydroxyl activity wise, HA receptor, HA synthesis. So again, this is a CAT slide which one needs to understand, because this can come up again as an MCQ, where you will be told that what is the HA receptor status, or what is the proliferation which happens in adult. So it is stimulation by TGF beta 1 and beta 2, while in fetal it is beta 3. Or signal transduction is PK pathway in fetus, while it is MEK or ERK pathway, which happens in adults. So this again can be a question for you in the MCQ, and you need to understand that well. Okay. So I think we have come to a close of this earlier session. Vinayak will just take a break for about 2 to 5 minutes, if that is okay. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So in the meantime, you guys can just stretch out, and anything from so far, whatever we have discussed, anyone has any questions? Yes, anyone?
Sir, about that PCNA expression.
Which one?
PCNA expression keloid versus hypertrophic scar chart.
Just a minute. Huh?
Yes. This one.
This one.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, what do you want about it?
Means I don't know. Means what is PCNA expression?
Yeah, there are certain things which you'll have to just mug up, dear.
Okay.
Because what happens is
Staining.
Yeah. So you just have to, because see, there will be so many mnemonics, so many things that if you can look at this, you have the tumor growth factor, we have the interleukin 1, 6. So there may be a question coming in. If you try to go into this kind of a little microscopic thing, it may be very difficult for you to remember the major gross thing. Remember in exams, don't try to dig into too much of microscopic things, because when you look at the picture at large, it's always better to skip one MCQ which has got more numbers and alphabets, rather than doing, solving other 8, and rather than wasting a time in scratching your head, what is this alpha SM actin expressing? You understood? So
yes,
there is a lot of basic sciences questions which we need to understand. But what I'm trying to tell you, giving you an example, is that when you have something like this, remember the major components like P53 levels. So we know what is P. You know what is myofibroblast. So remember the important components. It becomes very, very easy. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Yes.
So I'm very happy that you are quite focused. Yeah. Good. Very good. Anyone else? Any other questions? So now remember again this slide. What we talked about. So we know that all the growth factors are increased in place of inflammation. So we need not remember individually whether it is a platelet-derived growth factor, or it is a tumor growth factor, or which growth factor. So the moment you know that there is something which is GF, or the growth factor which comes in the MCQ, in scarring, we know that I have to tick on that question. But I need not know TGF beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. So this is a trick in exams, that you should know. Growth factors are increased. So anything which has got GF, I will tick on GF.
Okay, grossly.
So that will, grossly,
Yes.
when you put up GF, then you
Yes,
can
sir.
answer that well. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions, anyone? any other questions? Are you people understanding? Is it too much? It is too high, or it is too low, or it's too basic? Let me hear something from the junior guys. Yeah, the junior most team, the freshers. Are you understanding? Because I always feel that when you understand with clinical context and examples of what I give real life, the teaching becomes easy. Because now we are slowly moving from basic sciences to more and more clinical topics in Bailey and Love, which will make things more interesting. Yes, anyone? Okay, fine.
Sir, we are going fine.
So,
Means
yeah.
we are covering gross thing very quickly, and that's what is needed, sir. Because when sometime we
Correct.
open the book, it takes a lot of times, and we waste 4 hours in just one chapter. Rather than
Correct.
we are in
Correct.
less time, we are covering more topics.
Yeah, so because you're covering now, next time when you're going to read about the tissue healing or hypertrophic scar, it will become very easy because you
Yes.
already have a picture in front of you. You know what the WAC is. So the moment you know about the WAC, you know the three
Right.
principal features about it. So you can answer the question subsequently very easily. Okay.
Yes,
So now we will come to the next part of the talk, which is on the tissue engineering and the regeneration, which will be talking more and more again about more and more in terms of the numbers and the names. So what is a stem cell? So basically, can anyone tell me the concept about stem cell? What exactly do you mean by that? In a very simple language, anyone? Anyone can start. What is your concept about stem cell?
Multipotent cell with
Anyone otherwise?
varied differentiation.
Sorry, I didn't get you. What? Pluripotent.
A multipotent or pluripotent cell which can differentiate into uh, any other tissue or organ.
Okay. And how does that happen?
The appropriate growth factors and appropriate hormones at appropriate time, it can grow into the destined organ or tissue.
Okay, fine. So with this concept, what is a stem cell? So it's a mesenchymal stem cell. It's a primitive cells, and it has the ability to reduce inflammation, fight apoptosis, and it can differentiate what you mentioned into different types of cells, whatever we want, and it can also self-replicate. So this is what exactly is the meaning of the stem cells. Basically, they are categorized into types which are according to their differentiation potential, a totipotent or a pluripotent, these are the self-propagating cells, or a multipotent, unipotent, oligopotent, and then according to the origin. So if they are derived from the embryos, they can be embryonic stem cells or embryonic germ cells. Then if they are derived from the fetus or infants, in infants, it can be from the umbilical cord or the Wharton's jelly, or if they're derived from the adults, it can be any one of these. So this will be your gross outline about what are the types of the stem cells according to the origin and according to the differentiation. So you're talking about totipotent. So these are the totipotent cells. These cells can form the embryo and the placenta. Where the pluripotent cells, this can just form the embryo and not the placenta. These are self-growing cells. And then you have the multipotent cells, which are cells which are mentioned over here from the hemopoietic system, from the neural system, mesenchymal cells, blood cells, cells of the nervous system, and then they can get into a full maturity. So mesenchymal cells are essentially derived from the bone marrow, adipose tissue, umbilical cord, periosteum, tendons, muscles, and the skin. Now look at this. They have significant anti-inflammatory effect. They also have immunomodulatory effect in the inflammatory phase of the wound healing. So we saw that inflammatory phase of the wound healing. In the proliferative phase, they can stimulate the fibroblast, keratinocytes, and endothelial cells, thereby accelerating wound closure. So these cells, they become very, very important even in the wound healing. It is not just about they forming a heart or they forming a piece of lung or they forming a piece of liver, but it's also that they help into the phases of wound healing. And there have been demonstrations that even the wound contraction was much reduced, when the mesenchymal stem cells were put into, and angiogenesis was increased and epithelialization progressed very rapidly. So mesenchymal stem cells are the ones which are derived from this. Most of the times, the common source is the adipose tissue, and typically this gets collected from the liposuction. So whenever the patient undergoes a liposuction for some reason, whatever is the fat which is sucked out, that is used in production of these stem cells. Stem cells can be administered either topically or systematic or through the systemic pathway. Topical application can be with fibrogen or thrombin, and it can be applied to chronic wounds in form of spray. So we saw in the earlier slide that how they help in the wound healing by proliferating the entire phase, contracting the wound faster. So they help in that way. Now, if you combine them with one of these fibrinogen or thrombin, they can help in making a chronic wound heal faster. That can also come in form of a lot of gels. So today, we have a lot of platelet-derived growth factors which are available in the market. So these are exogenous forms where you can give this kind of growth factors into the wound to make the wounds heal much faster. So coming from the tissues, if you have a stem cell which is originating from the skin, you can use it for patients of burns or even after excision or for the trauma. If they are derived from the cardiac muscle, that can be used typically for heart failure and even for patients with cardiomyopathy. So in clinical practice, a lot of times patients with cardiomyopathy, a lot of stem cell work is going on. Even patients with MI, where they have a certain sections of the heart which is scarred out, there are centers abroad where they are now injecting them into stem cells which are cardiac in origin so that they can regenerate and form a good myocardium. Then you can have heart valves, then from the cartilage, which is typically, again, a very big use for traumatic and degenerative disorders like osteoarthritis, where a lot of cartilage-based products are now being used. Then from the trachea and bronchus, for the congenital and acquired stenosis or after resection of malignancy. So practically, most of the tubular and non-tubular organs are now formed by growing up from the stem cells. So tissue engineering and regenerative therapies have potential to provide a treatment for a wide range of diseases. Clinical applications in the surgical assessment and the treatments are mandatory, and there are models to test therapeutic efficacy and toxicity. So if you have an engineered tissue, then you have a combination of the stem cell biology, cell signaling biology, scaffold designing, which we'll be talking about soon, and bioreactor design. And this in combinations can regenerate, and it can help you to practically grow any kind of cells. So what are the cells in the tissue engineering and regenerative? So these are the basic 5 types which are used. So you can have a somatic cells. The availability is a little bit limited, but you have something like a somatic stem cells, which I call it as a workhorse, because these are the ones which are easily available. They expand, pluripotency is limited, ethical concerns are not there as of now, and the most important is the risk of malignancy. So say, for example, you're going to grow from a stem cell, you're going to grow up a new liver, or you're going to grow up a new piece of lung tissue. There are a lot of concerns that by overgrowing of the cells, whether you're going to induce a concept of oncogenesis. So when we're going to talk about malignancy and principles of oncology, we will understand it's the body's own cells which suddenly start replicating and behave in a very haphazard way, and that's where you can have a growth of a tumor or a formation of a tumor. Similarly, in stem cells, there is a risk of malignancy, but it is low when you're using the somatic stem cells. Then you have the autologous presence, yes, and likely to be future use is going to be very, very high. So this is what I call it as a workhorse in stem cells. Then you have stem cells which are of human embryonic origin, fetal cells, and then you have induced pluripotent stem cells. We will just talk about it in a little details. So stem cells, they can be classified according to whether they are derived from the early embryo, which are known as embryonic stem cells, or tissues from the fetuses, also called as fetal stem cells, or later in the development, what we call it as an adult or somatic stem cell, which we just talked about, which is a workhorse, or whether they are derived by the reprogramming adult specialized cells to become pluripotent stem cells. So these are the ones, this is how you define the stem cells. So a mesenchymal stem cell, what we talked about, will be typically derived from a bone marrow, adipose tissue, or an umbilical cord. It typically resembles a fibroblast, and you can see it can go into different ways. It can be used for immunomodulation. It can be used for formation of osteoblasts, chondrocytes, adipocytes, and others. So this is a way it can work into different ways. So mesenchymal stem cells, or MSC, is the one which is, this is a very important slide, and this can again be one of your MCQ questions. And how they look is they resemble fibroblast. So MSC, what else it has? It has got anti-inflammatory property. So again, that would be very, very useful. It can produce various growth factors and prostaglandins, and it can be differentiated into desired lineage by adding growth factors. So you just mentioned in the beginning, one of you, that you can add a growth factor or some chemicals into this, and then you can decide what exactly you're planning to make out of it, and you can do that. And the therapeutic yield of these are basically from the fat which comes from the liposuction or the iliac crest aspiration. So these are the two sources from where this can come up. So IPC, what is IPSC? Induced pluripotent stem cells. Okay. So this is what typically happens. What happens in this is that you have peripheral blood or the mononuclear or the skin where you get the keratinocytes. These are then put into reprogramming factors, and by adding these reprogramming factors, you develop the induced pluripotent cells. Here now you'll be adding differentiation factors, and then from there you can decide whether out of this you're going to have a piece of tendon which is going to get produced, or a nerve which is going to get produced, or a pancreas which is going to get produced. So if you see, typically mononuclear cells from the peripheral bloods or keratinocytes from the skin are cultured and reprogrammed to become the iPSC by adding reprogramming factors. Now this is very, very crucial, because once you add this, they get into iPSC, and these iPSC are then expanded and they're differentiated into getting into different specialty. It is like from MBBS, then you learn something and then you get into MS, and after getting MS, you give your MCH Onco or GI or something, and then you go to different fields, whether you're going to do a pediatric surgery, or you're going to do a neurosurgery, or you're going to do a cardiothoracic surgery. So this is how is the concept also in stem cells. A somatic cell, and if you add a retrovirus into that, again, you can produce an iPSC. And this typically has a problem, because if these retroviruses, because of the genomic integration, it can even lead to cancer formation. So we saw that slide earlier on where I showed you about the potency of malignancy. So if you see this risk of malignancy, in somatic cells it is none, in SSC it is low, while in the other three it is moderate. And why does that happen is because this can induce. So it's very simple. You're trying to make some cell grow n number of times, and you're adding certain things into that. You can have an oncogenic potential. So this is one of the danger which scientists and doctor community we are looking at, that one needs to be very, very careful when you're getting into the stem cell business, because that's where you can have problems of malignancy. Something about fetal stem cells. These are derived from the blood, bone marrow, and other tissues of the aborted fetuses which are available. And these are then modified, and they can be used in treatment of Parkinson's or diabetes by forming different pancreatic islet cells or spinal cord injury. This is one of the things which is very commonly used nowadays into the clinical practice. So a lot of centers now where they treat the patients with neurological problems, and that's happening because of these fetal stem cells. A new concept now is coming about scaffolds. That means something like this. So you have cells which are present in different forms. Can you have something like a scaffold? That means something like an extracellular matrix. And can you put these cells onto that? That means it's like a sheet, and on that sheet, you're probably adding on something like, the wiring into that area, and then you're making it more thicker. It is like formation of something like a mesh. So if you do that, the end result, what you get in this is that you will get all these cells now, which will be impregnated with this scaffold. And this is which will be very, very useful to the patient. So again, you can see that this is what happens. You add on a scaffold into that or a matrix. And once you add on to the matrix, you will have all these cells and then a scaffold on that. So this is the basis of the scaffold-based engineering, that the stem cells are now attached to an extracellular matrix. And what are these different matrices? This matrix, what are the requirements? What scaffold you can use? So these are the ones which basically should provide structural support to these stem cells. They should allow them to get attached, migrate, and proliferate. So it's like a sheet where the cells can move around and they can grow. You should provide enough oxygen, nutrients, and regulatory factors to all these cells while they are into that matrix. Deliver signals to promote cell migration and proliferation, and it should be biocompatible, non-immunogenic, and ideally it should be biodegradable. Because if we want that over a period of time, this particular scaffold which you're going to form should get merged with the native tissue of the patient. So this is typically a picture of a regenerative scaffold. It provides, but it can be of two varieties. So that scaffold which I talked about, the sheet, it can be natural or it can be artificial. So what are the natural scaffolds? It can be prepared by removal of the residual cell types from the tissue, for example, with the detergent, or it consists of a tissue matrix which can preserve intricate anatomical structures. That means you have a sheet where you remove or wash out all the cells, and now that sheet remains. So you have a muscle with the fascia. You remove all the overlying muscle and just keep the fascia intact. This is an extracellular matrix. On top of that cells, if you're going to put up the stem cells, this can allow you to grow a proper muscle in the future. And do we have something which are known as artificial scaffolds or scaffolds which I talked to you about? Yes, there are natural materials, there are synthetic polymers, bio-tipped ceramics and glasses. These also are used as scaffolds, and new or smart materials that have biomimetic properties are also included into this artificial scaffold. So what are the approaches to seed the cells? So that means you now have a sheet, you are going to put it. What are the different ways in which you can do that? So you can have an elaborate reading in the textbook, but the ways it will be put is a concept. Static cell seeding. Then you have a dynamic cell seeding where it is actually put in. Then you have something which is known as magnetic cell seeding. That means a magnetic field is prepared in the extracellular matrix. You put in the stem cells there, and this magnet will try to pull and get all the cells together. So this is also known as a magnetic cell seeding. Or you have a pressure and a vacuum seeding. So all these things, the basic fundamental is that it is addition of the cells into the scaffold. These are all the different ways in which you can do that. Once you read into the textbook, into the Bailey, you will get into the details, but you have understood with that figure what is the concept. Once you know the concept, when you read, it becomes easy for you to understand that. So what are the challenges which you are facing in the tissue engineering today? We know that the oxygen and the nutrient supply is very, very crucial. So that has to be taken care at any time. Second thing is, things like skin or cornea, which have a flatter surface, these are better to cultivate compared to hollow tubular structures like trachea and bronchus, because it is really challenging to produce them. Not that it has not been done, but it can be done. And the extreme difficult ones are the solid organs like liver and kidney, because they need a lot of additional requirements. So it is not only oxygen and nutrients, but you have to prepare a complete cell line. And in the order of difficulty, it is from the skin, cornea, which is easier, tubular organs are a little difficult, liver and kidney. So again, you can have a question which can be based on this, that what are the challenges in the tissue engineering? So what is the word of caution? This is a little dangerous slide. So what are the disadvantages of all this stem cell business of the tissue engineering? Tumor formation. We saw that, because you can have a lot of cells which can just keep on replicating. So you never know that it can lead to oncogenesis and tumor formation. Genetic and epigenetic abnormalities, because whatever will be an abnormality in one of the cells can get passed on to the new stem cells or the organ which you're going to create, and you can have a transformation there. You can transmit infections. You can have poor viability or a loss of function. So if you're going to produce a liver out of a stem cell, you are not sure how good the nutrient has got into that and what is going to be the function of that new liver. It can differentiate to undesired cell types. That means you are planning to make a chondrocyte, but it can get into an islet cell, because these are going to be a microscopic event, so you really don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes you can have rejections, especially if you have with allogenic cells. If it is same patient to patient, it is very, very unlikely that you will have any rejection. And in some of the cases where you have used artificial stuff from outside, you can have side effects of immunosuppression. So all these things are the risk factors. You may have an option in the exam where they will be giving you first 3 options, and the 4th option may be the one which will be out of the context, and they may be telling you what is false about risk of cell-based therapy. So you should know that. Basically, it's very simple. You're trying to put in and make in something which is going to be replicating very fast. If something which is going to replicate very fast, then you can have side effects of that. Okay. I think that's going to probably end this session. Any questions on this part? Yes, anyone?
If you have any doubts, you can ask sir right away.
I think this is one slide which, if you understand, it makes your life very easy. Yeah, what is the concept of the scaffold and stem cells? The reason I'm taking break is, because I need to give some rest to the vocal cords as well, because non-stop talking for such a long time. So we will start with the MCQs. I think we've got about 8 or 10, which will end up our session today. The way I propose to do this is, let us go through the entire stem and all the options available. And then what I'm going to do today is I'll pick up the participants, because I practically have the list of everyone, and I'll try to pick up one of them randomly so that all of you are alert. And then if that particular person is not in a position to answer, we will give a choice to someone who wants to answer. Does that sound good for all of you? Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Great. I think that yes, sir was very, very low. That pitch was very low. Okay. I think maybe more and more exams, and we will come to that. So for the first session, first question, I think today we will just catch up the people who are in the front. So we have Rohit and Anish, Karthik, Kumar. Okay, fine. So let the first question come to Dr. Fine. So Dr. Rohit, you can take this question. Rohit, are you around? Rohit? So during the inflammatory phase of wound healing, adenosine diphosphate plays a major role in wound healing. Adenosine diphosphate is secreted by platelets, fibroblasts, neutrophils, megakaryocytes. Yes, anyone wants to take this? Dr. Rohit?
Yes, sir. Platelets.
Platelets. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we saw that, isn't it? So we saw in that slide. So now what happens is that if you go into the reading of the text, if you go into more details of adenosine diphosphate and everything, we know that in the first stage of inflammatory phase or the wound healing phase, we heard about platelets. We never heard about fibroblasts, neutrophils, or megakaryocytes. So platelets stick to the damaged endothelial cells, release adenosine diphosphate, which causes thrombogenic activity. So this is where it leads to formation of the white plaque. Okay. And once you have the white plaque formation, then you can have the red plaque. And platelets also release platelet-derived growth factors, platelet factor 4, and TGF beta. Okay. So all of you who want to probably understand that in a little microscopic details, platelets also release PDGF, platelet-derived growth factor, platelet growth factor 4, and transforming growth factor beta. And this is how this ends this particular stem. The major driver cell of the proliferative phase of the wound healing is, yes, Dr. Anish?
Fibroblast.
Okay, why?
Sir, because it secretes collagen, sir.
Absolutely. Good. Very good. So proliferative wound phase consists mainly of fibroblast activity, production of collagen and the ground substance, glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans, growth of new capillaries, capillary loops, and reepithelialization of the wound surface. And one more thing which happens in the proliferative phase, anyone? The red tissue which is formed, what we call it as?
Engineering.
What red
Granulation
tissue is
tissue.
in the
Granulation tissue.
granulation
Injury.
tissue?
Granulation.
Granulation tissue. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good. This one, I think everyone probably will get it unanimously. The proliferation phase of the wound healing lasts up to
3 weeks.
3 weeks.
absolutely. So this is what we saw. I showed you that cycle. Hemostasis is in minutes, 2 hours. Inflammatory phase for the first 7 days. Proliferative phase goes on for about 3 weeks time, and remodeling starts somewhere here, and then it goes up to 2 years. Okay, good. In the remodeling phase of wound healing, what happens? Okay,
Type
now
3
read this.
collagen
This is a
replaced
very
by type
confusing
B.
slide.
B.
No, let us go through all of them one by one. Type 1 collagen is replaced by type 3, 3 is replaced by 1, or 4 is actively deposited, or 2 gets replaced. What?
3 is replaced by
Answer?
1. 3 is
Yeah.
replaced by
So
1.
you
B.
have, so you heard me saying that empty number of times in this presentation. 3 to 1, 3 to 1, and we have 19 types of collagen. We don't have to bother about that. In the wound healing, we have to bother about type 3 and type 1. So the remodeling phase is characterized by the maturation of collagen, and the type 3 gets converted to type 1. There is a realignment of the fibers, and the wound contraction then slowly goes in, and this ultimately goes on for about 2 years. Okay, so next one will be for Dr. Shruti. Are you there, Dr. G. Shruti?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Sorry, I answered for you. Anyway, we'll keep the next one for you, Shruti. So whenever there's a nerve injury, the Valerian degeneration happens proximal to the site of injury. Okay, we saw that, right? That is the wrong answer. The right answer is happens distal to the site of injury. So we did see that if this is a nerve, this is an injury which is happening, it occurs distally, then there is regeneration, and then there is a synapses with the muscle. Okay. So Shruti, you can take this one. A split thickness skin graft is an example of primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. Think about the question. We discussed about everything. Now you tell us the answer.
Secondary.
Are you sure, Dr. Shruti?
No, sir.
Anyone prefers?
Tertiary intention.
Tertiary, sir. Tertiary. C.
Second.
Tertiary. One is saying secondary, one is tertiary.
B.
Anyone else?
Tertiary.
Anyone else has got a different option? Tertiary? Yes.
Tertiary, sir.
So the answer is tertiary intention. Okay. Because we saw types of wound healing. Primary intention, clean wounds. You make a cut, you suture, that is a clean wound. Secondary intention, healthy granulation tissue, overgrowth of the tissue. You don't do anything here. So in the secondary, what did I say? You don't do anything. Slowly, you will apply a whack. There will be a formation of scar formation and it will heal. And in tertiary, we try to do something. So what I mentioned was something like a secondary suturing, but the skin grafting also falls a part of it, because that wound or that area which has got granulated, you as a surgeon are trying to do some intervention in a delayed fashion. Because you're doing it in the delayed fashion, you are allowing it to heal, and that is healing by tertiary intention. So everyone very clear on this?
Excuse me, sir. Would the flap coverage be also under the tertiary intention only?
No, flap cover, when are you going to do? If you're going to do a primary flap cover, if you
Yeah.
have an injury and a primary flap cover, that will be primary intention, no? Because it's a primary. You will never
Okay.
do a secondary flap, you understood? So flaps are usually done in an active tissue where, say for example, you're going to do a mastectomy and you're going to do a flap on that side, or a patient has got an injury on the palm and you're going to do a pre-flap. It's going to be healing by primary intention because it's a clean wound, isn't it? Tertiary
Okay.
intention are typically those wounds which are there for who keep coming to you for dressing, and at one point the patient says, "Please, doctor, do something about it. I'm fed up of this," and you say, "Okay, fine, come over. We'll put in a graft, or come over. I'll just close that wound." That is tertiary.
Sir, in certain wounds, like in which those wounds in which tendons are exposed, we tend to put a rotational flap over them. So what would that be? Or
Yeah.
a
So if
free
you're going to
flap
put in a rotational flap,
or a free
I
flap
understand.
in
I
case.
understand what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're going to put in, so if you put up something like that, I would probably categorize that again in the tertiary intention.
Tertiary
So this will
intention.
be a category because this is a wound which has been there for a long time and you are doing something. So the moment you put in a graft or a flap on a wound which is already granulated, that will be tertiary intention.
Okay, sir.
Okay?
Thank you.
Good. Okay, so the next one, who wants to take this up? Dr. Anis, I think. Anis, did you answer? Anis? Mrs. Savita Gopal developed a pressure sore after suffering a stroke 5 years ago. Okay. A treating surgeon wants to know the most common site for the pressure sore.
Ischium, sir.
Ischium, sir, ischium.
Good. So we saw that slide. And which one was the last one? Anyone?
Occiput, occiput.
Occipital.
Very good. Good. So I'm happy everyone is not sleeping. Yeah, all of you are awake. Good. Thank you. So you were paying attention very well. Thank you. So this is how it is. Ischium, greater trochanter, sacrum, heel, malleolus, and the last is occiput. Good. Very good. Okay. Next one. Bed sores are formed when external pressure exceeds the capillary occlusive pressure. At
30
what
30,
pressure
30.
does this occur?
30, sir, 30.
Good. So this was a catch where I mentioned in my text about overcoming the pressure, but I didn't mention about what pressure. It's good. So some of you have read that topic well in advance. That's very good. So at 30, the blood flow to the skin will cease, leading to tissue, anoxia, necrosis, and ulceration. Okay. So it's a very theoretical, pure question, but it helps you in clinical practice. It tells you at what pressure it happens. So the lucky answer is 30. Sorry about this, but Rajkumar had a pressure source of loss of dermis and a part of the dermis. Obviously, we know it is 2. Can anyone tell me what is 3?
Subcutaneous tissue involvement.
Subcutaneous tissue.
And 4?
Muscle, skin, or
Exposed.
bone involvement.
Bone.
Muscle, bone, tendons, sir.
Exposed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So this is how it is. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 up to the adipose, and stage 4, which will go up to the muscle or the bone. Why is this answer coming up now? Yeah. Anyway. Sorry about this. So Ravi Goswami, a senior surgeon, suffered a trauma to his thigh after he fell off his ski. What is the most likely diagnosis? So we did touch upon this, but this typically happens in a degloving injury, what is also known as a Morel Levely lesion. These are post-traumatic degloving injuries occurring deep to the subcutaneous plane, and this happens because of the disruption of the capillaries in an effusion containing hemolymph-necrotic fat. MRI is a choice in evaluation of the Morel Levely lesion. Early diagnosis is essential because a delay in the diagnosis can lead to necrosis. So this is something like how it looks like. So this is the skin, subcute, fascia, deep fascia, and the muscle. Now, when you have an avulsion, you have ripping apart of all these layers in the front, and there'll be a shearing activity here. This will lead to a potential collection of all this material into this. This is known as a Morel Levely mechanism. Okay? Yes. What is this? The figure on your left.
Keloid.
Keloid, sir.
Keloid.
And the figure on the right?
Hypertrophic scar.
Keloid.
Absolutely. So the figure on the left is keloid. The figure on the right is hypertrophic scar. Good. Okay. Next one. Mr. Dubey, who heads the stem cell research lab at AIIMS, wants to test you regarding your knowledge of mesenchymal stem cells. You remember I had shown that slide.
Yes,
Which of the following statements is not true, or which of the following statement is false?
B.
MSc
B.
can be differentiated. No, let us finish off the questions, doctor. Please wait, because there are a lot of juniors also. Mesenchymal cells can be differentiated into desired lineage in vitro by addition of suitable growth factors and chemicals. One potential disadvantage is that they can have pro-inflammatory properties. MSCs are isolated in vitro on basis of their adherence to plastic. Liposuction is a legitimate method of obtaining MSc. Yes, so what is the answer? Which is
B.
false?
They have anti-inflammatory properties.
Correct. So the answer is that it is B. Okay. So we discussed that. There was a major slide which I had put up that they have anti-inflammatory properties and not pro-inflammatory. That's attributed because of the various growth factors we talked about. MSc for therapeutic use can be isolated from the bone marrow or from the liposuction. We discussed these are the two sources which are less invasive and they give high yield. In both cases, MSCs are isolated on the basis of adherence to the plastic. They can be either immediately or after expansion in their numbers in the vitro cultures, they can be used. Alternatively, they can be differentiated into the desired lineage. So we did see that slide. This one, I think it's not there, but we did see that slide where we discussed about that it can be going into any lineage, whichever you want. Dr. Prakash Natarajan is working on iPSC in a lab at Cambridge. And he has some questions for you. Which statement is not true? Okay, Option number 1. Reprogramming factors such as NANOG and LIN2 are required to induce differentiation. They are inherently safe as there is no risk of oncogenic activation. iPSC proliferate into vitro as ESC and are pluripotent, and they were developed in 2006 by Shinya Yamanaka. Which is not true?
B, sir. B. Risk of malignancy is high, sir.
They have a certain risk of oncogenic activation.
Absolutely. So we discussed about that, isn't it? That oncogenesis is something. So again, to sum up, iPSC were developed by Professor Shinya Yamanaka on an earlier work based by John Gordon. This again, so these are things which can be asked in the exams. Retroviral or lentiviral transfection is used to induce a combination of transcription factors into this to produce a particular lineage. So it is shown that somatic cell cells can be reprogrammed to become a stem cell. And iPSC proliferated in vitro efficiently as ECS and as pluripotent, thereby circumventing certain use with the use of human embryos. Reprogramming somatic cells to become iPSC using retroviruses. I showed you that slide where a somatic cell with retrovirus and you can use and become a stem cell. This can lead to activation of oncogene or also tumorigenesis. So we discussed in that slide about that. And to reduce this risk, non-retroviral vectors such as adenovirus and Sendai virus vectors that do not insert their own genes into the host genome are being used. So the right answer is B, because they are inherently safe, that there is no risk. Okay, so it is false statement. Okay, so this is what we discussed about creating blood or keratinocytes, adding reprogramming factors, developing iPSC. iPSC then are added with differentiating factors, and you can produce whatever you want in different ways. Okay. Okay, good. So this is what we end the session here with the MCQ. We'll try and have more of the MCQs. Any questions, anyone so far? Vinayak, I hope today we have gone through a fairly detailed section in terms of the MCQs.
Oh, absolutely. So I think today's session was one of the most comprehensive sessions on a very difficult topic, I must say. A topic which is not amenable to most surgeons, a topic which even I have read the same book, and a topic which I have often chosen to skip because I have not understood it perfectly. And I think today's class, I often regret the fact that I've started my MCH, because I think I would have enjoyed the session before I joined my MCH and before I had written the exams. So I think I would expect a similar reaction from most of the other students over here today. So thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session.
So tomorrow's session will be on surgical and the tropical infections. So read about it in details. Again, it is going to be a clinical topic. I will be trying to put in a lot of MCQs into that as well. And we're going to have a discussion on. So essentially, the idea is, I want to go into the details of most of the topics. But what happens is, in trying to get you into too much of a details, we will be losing on the major concepts. The idea is to integrate the concept. So when you read the chapter back again, this should not be, these sessions are the ones which will be the primer for you to understand the concept when you read back the chapter. So this should not be taken as a replacement of skipping or not reading the chapter at all. So when you have sessions like this, it makes your concept very, very clear. And then when you go and read back, then you can highlight certain things which we discussed about.
Thank you so much. Students, I'd just like to give you a small piece of advice. I know it's quite late, but I would like you to go and solve the MCQs on the Searchtest app right away, because it will give you a little more perspective about what to read and what not to read. The classes, as sir told, are not meant to be a substitute for actual reading of the textbooks, but they're just meant to be a supplement for understanding of the concepts. So thank you so much, sir.